Britain entered World War II on the 1st of September 1939, when they declared war on Germany following their invasion of Poland. Britain was pretty unprepared for war on the whole, but there had been some key preparations for people in Britain that either had been put in place or were put in place after that declaration of war. One of the key things that was put in place straight away on declaration of war was an organisation called the ARP was set up, which was Air Raid Precautions. Their job was to organise Britain in the event of air raids. And of course, in 1939, when war started, the worry was that pretty quickly Britain would be bombed, and predictions on how many casualties there would be in that instance were very, very high. In fact, in the millions in some cases. In fact, I think one of the predictions was that there would be 1 million dead within a month and 3 million would be refugees. So as a result of that, this organisation, the ARP, was set up. 500,000 people volunteered for the organisation in the first month of the war. And they would be siphoned off into things like being ARP wardens. And the ARP warden's job would be to organise all the emergency services, to ensure that blackouts were taking place. So they'd almost be like a blackout police. They would go around and make sure that, and shout at people if, that, for example, their windows weren't covered. They'd make sure the blackout was enforced on the streets. They would also be there to help and support people who perhaps had had their homes bombed, etc. You know, and almost a link for those people between what happens next once your home has been bombed. So it was a support organisation, but it was also there for security as well. The government also, on declaration of war, but they told people to build air raid shelters. And the first air raid shelters that they told them to build were Anderson shelters. Anderson shelters, very simple, corrugated iron, sandbags at the bottom of the garden. You would basically dig a hole in the garden. You would then place the corrugated iron, kind of creating a shed, but it was cylinder shaped. And then you would pour gravel and you put sandbags over that corrugated iron. It would be quite small. Some of them had bunk beds in them for the children. And it would be at the bottom of the garden. And they were called Anderson shelters. The government obviously encouraged people to on the event of an air raid, the air raid siren would sound. People in the middle of the night would have to get out of bed, go downstairs, go out into the garden and into the Anderson shelter. A fantastic film, by the way, if you want to see that in action, is Hope and Glory. It's only, I think, a couple of pounds on Amazon. And in the film, you actually see a family in London during the Blitz who actually, in the middle of the night, go into the Anderson shelter. You also, in the film, see it being built by that family. Really good, well worth a watch, particularly the first hour of that film. But the government told people to build these shelters, and especially in urban areas, and obviously lots did. So Manchester, Birmingham, London, you know, especially in the suburbs, people immediately on declaration of war started to build them. Equally, in 1938, an organisation called the British Balloon Command was set up in 1938, and one of their key jobs was to organise the distribution of barrage balloons. And barrage balloons were large blimps almost that were placed on string and held up on string above major towns and cities across the United Kingdom, but particularly in the southeast from September 1939 onwards. And the main idea behind these huge balloons was that if the Germans did launch bombing attacks, they wouldn't be able to go at low level because they wouldn't see the balloons in the dark, and they would hit them and it would be too complicated to get round them, and potentially they would crash land. They were, well, we're going to come on to the Blitz in a following tutorial, but they were actually quite effective in that way. The Germans did have to go to a higher altitude, but really they were only effective against dive bombers, against Stukas, which the Germans used in the early part of the war actually against Britain in the Blitz. But later on, they developed heavy bombers, which had a high altitude anyway when they dropped the bombs. A really key preparation that was... I wouldn't say it was a preparation for war, but it was something that the government in Britain, Chamberlain particularly, had this appreciation of the role of technology in any war against Germany or any other country. And one of the key developments in that remit was from 1935 onwards, a gentleman called Robert Watson Watt. Robert Watson Watt was developing something called radar in Britain, and by 1939 he had built what was called the chain home. The chain home being a series of radar stations in the southeast of England, on the south coast. And I'm not a scientist, but radar sends signals. And when it hits something, it sends those signals back, which tells you the position, for example, of a German plane. It gives you time to understand when that plane's going to arrive. It means that you can map that, and it was absolutely vital, we're going to see later, in Britain defeating Germany in the Battle of Britain, was the use of radar. And in fact, it was given to the Americans early on in the war as a present. For all the kit that America was actually sending to Britain at that time in the war. So it was valuable in lots of different ways. And in 1939, thank goodness, the stations were complete and they were operational and they were ready to be used. So there were preparations that we can see here, but ultimately, overall, the British Army is small. The British Air Force is small. So conscription is introduced straight away in September 1939, and 1.5 million people are conscripted into the British Armed Forces. Most of those go to the Army. A smaller number go to the RAF and the Navy, who also need more personnel. So the government, even though Britain is unprepared for a war, if you imagine the German army, they've been spending a heck of a lot of money on on building up that army. Hitler's rearmament drive has made the German army particularly powerful and strong in every area, army, navy, air force. The Luftwaffe is a large organisation by this point. The RAF is small, but it does have good planes and good equipment. And we'll come on to that later when we talk about the Battle of Britain.